Hi everyone, we're going to be covering chapter 1, which is fairly straightforward. It is just a quick introduction to anatomy and physiology. So let me switch modes here. I don't know if you can see my whiteboard or not, but we'll figure it out. All right, so just a quick introduction to A&P is what we're going through right now. A&P is actually the oldest science. It's been studied pretty much ever since people have been around. They've been looking at the human body and trying to figure out how it works. There are two different parts to this course, and you'll understand that very quickly. The anatomy is the structure. So this is the what. The physiology is the how. This is how everything fits together. This is the actual processes that our body undergoes and the equilibrium and the balance that our body has to maintain. So for the most part, we'll be looking at the anatomy in lab, and the physiology will be lecture. There's kind of some gray area in A&P 1. In A&P 2, that's even more so important. In A&P 2, it'll mostly only be physiology in lecture. This A&P 1, we kind of do a little bit of both. So there's gross anatomy, which is looking at the big stuff, our exterior surfaces, the big features, arm, leg, right, those big things. Then there's regional anatomy, where you would talk about a specific area of the body, the abdomen, the head, and then systemic anatomy, which is when you would talk about specific body systems like the digestive system or the reproductive system. In microscopic anatomy, we're actually looking at cells. So a lot of people assume that in A&P, we're just looking at big stuff, but we're actually looking at a lot of little stuff. And it's actually the little stuff that makes it possible for all the big stuff to do what it does. So all of those cells are very specialized, as we'll see in chapter 4 especially. So those cells are specialized to give those larger structures their characteristics. So we have things like histology and cytology and microbiology all coming from this area of science. So there's cell physiology, there's also organ physiology, where you're looking at the function of a specific organ, and that all goes into systemic physiology, looking at the whole organ system put together. And all of those can lead into the pathological physiology, which is our diseased state, which could impact one or many organs, organ systems, tissues, etc. So let's talk about those levels of organization. So if we break all of our bodies down into their smallest pieces, so to speak, you have what's called the chemical or molecular level of organization. This is where we have atoms and molecules, right? We're all basically big bags of protein walking around, and those proteins organize themselves to create cells, and those cells are all working together to form tissues. So those specific tissues, they're groups of cells that are working together to perform a specific function, such as covering, lining, contracting, right? Sending signals like a nerve cell, right? There's 4 types of tissues. You should start familiarizing yourself with those right now. Epithelial tissue, that's the covering and lining. Connective tissue, it's kind of a hodgepodge group. Muscle tissue, which is contractile, and nervous tissue, which sends and receives signals. So after the tissue level of organization, then we have the organ level of organization. An organ is when 2 or more tissues are working together to perform a similar function. So our heart is an organ. It's made of 2 or more tissues. Our brain is an organ made of 2 or more tissues, etc. Then we have the organ system, which is when we have lots of organs working together to perform a similar function or a related function. We have 11 body systems total, and we'll start looking at these body systems. You have the integumentary body system. The integumentary system is one that most students don't realize is even a system. This is our skin, which includes our hair, nails, all the glands that excrete onto the skin surface, like oil glands, sweat glands. Skeletal system, this is all of our bones and cartilage and the ligaments, and then the inside structures of the bone, including the bone marrow. Then we have the muscular system, obviously for movement. The nervous system, which is communicating between different parts of the body, kind of orchestrating all of the body's major processes. The endocrine system, which is another signaling mechanism. It just uses a different method of signaling than the nervous system. Our cardiovascular system, which is transporting, it's also regulating, and this is, of course, our heart and blood vessels. The lymphatic system, which includes our spleen and lymph nodes, tonsils, this is also lumped into our immune system. Our immune system is lumped into the lymphatic system, and this is when we have our body's defenses. Where we have our body's defenses, I should say. Sorry, it's late. Then we have the respiratory system, which is our breathing. This is all of our nasal passageways, our lungs, obviously the alveoli, the exchange surfaces within our lungs, our digestive system functioning to bring in nutrients into our body, the urinary system, which is filtering out our blood, getting rid of liquid waste products. And then we have the reproductive system, which is obviously different in males than in females. This includes all of our sex organs, external and internal sex organs to be included in that. So one last little topic, one of the last little topics of Chapter 1 is homeostasis. This is a concept that should have been taught to you or that you should have been introduced to in other biology courses, and this is all about maintaining a stable condition, a stable environment in your body, and this is what allows our body to kind of function within a normal range. In other words, our body temperature never gets too high. If it does get too high, that's a signal that something's going wrong in the body. Same thing with pH, right? Same thing with osmolarity. All of those things have to stay in balance. So there's methods of auto-regulating or regulating in general. One of those is auto-regulation. This is something that's going to automatically happen in your body. You don't have to think about it. So, or the cells don't have to be told to do it. They just automatically do it. Cells, when they're exposed to a hypotonic solution, they don't need an endocrine hormone to tell them that they're going to take in water or let water out of them. They just automatically do it. That's auto-regulation. That's all done intrinsically within individual cells. The extrinsic regulation is when other systems like the nervous system or the endocrine system come in and say, hey, we have a situation going on here and I need all of these blood vessels on this side of the body to dilate. And so that would be extrinsic regulation. So all homeostatic regulation processes have three main parts. First, you have some type of receptor. This receptor is responding to the stimulus. So whatever the stimulus may be, temperature, carbon dioxide concentration, pH, right, all of these factors. Then there's a control center. So the control center is taking the information from the receptor and saying, we got to do something about this. And then the effector. The effector is going to be what carries out the command. So in other words, you go out for a run, and in running, your muscles are contracting a lot. And when your muscles contract a lot, that creates a lot of friction, right, which creates heat. And that heat is going to raise your internal temperature. Well, there are special mechanisms in your brain, your hypothalamus, that say, oh, our blood temperature is getting a little too high. That's our receptor. Our receptor is then going to send a signal in response to that stimulus of elevated blood pressure and say, whoa, we need to simmer down now. We need to bring this body temperature down. So in doing that, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to start breathing more. We're going to start exhaling some of that hot air. We're going to dilate those blood vessels, get that heat to evaporate out of our body and diffuse out of our body. And we're also going to start sweating. So all of that is controlled from the control center. The control center tells the body to do that. The effector is going to be the sweat glands. It's going to be the blood vessels. It's going to be the alveoli that dilate in response to all of those signals. So here's another example in case you couldn't quite follow what I was describing. The effector basically negates the stimulus in the example of negative feedback. The example I just gave you was negative feedback. So we have a normal body temperature. Oh, it's body temperature example here too. Our normal body temperature is disturbed, our body temperature rises. So our temperatures receptors on our skin and hypothalamus are basically going to sense that our body temperature is changing. The control center is going to say, we need to cool this body down a little bit. And so it's going to start sweating and dilating blood vessels, eventually bringing our body temperature back to normal. That is an example of negative feedback, because what's happening is this stimulus, which is a increased body temperature, is being negated or turned off. Negative feedback does not mean that it's a bad thing. It just means that it's negated. It's turned off. The stimulus is turned off. Here's another example of insulin and glucagon in the pancreas with blood sugar. So you can take a look at that slide on your own. It's basically the same thing. We get too much of it, so we do something to turn that off. You get too little of something, so we do something to get it back up to normal. That's what negative feedback's all about. Positive feedback's a little different. In positive feedback, the effector, instead of negating the stimulus, is going to encourage the stimulus, increase the stimulus. There's a few instances where this happens in the body, where we would want a process to speed up. One of those is blood clotting, right? You get cut, oh no, you're bleeding, so you're going to have to keep those platelets coagulating and keep that fibrinogen forming. That is the process of blood clotting coagulation to protect the body. So that's positive feedback, where you have a break in the blood vessel, those damaged cells release, and this whole clotting process is just going to keep accelerating over and over and over again until the bleeding stops, right? Another example of positive feedback is labor and delivery, right? The uterus begins to contract, the cervix is dilated enough, the baby's low enough in the pelvic cavity that, it's ready to come out. So that uterus starts contracting, and it's going to keep contracting until it's over, right? Until the baby's delivered. Hopefully, that's not too long, right? And that's a feedback loop between oxytocin and the uterus, which if you've ever had a baby, you probably are a little bit familiar with that process. So this chart comes from the Martini textbook. Those of you that are at Hartford Community College, you have that book. Those of you that are at CCBC, you have a chart similar to this. All of the lectures that I do, I use the Hartford Community College textbook instead. I just like the textbook better than the CCBC textbook personally. I think it does a little bit better job covering the information. So you'll see that the images don't quite match up if you're in my CCBC course. But either way, it's all here. It's all the same information. It's just presented slightly different to help you. So this is going through the different organ systems in the body and how they work in homeostatic regulation. So for example, in regulating body temperature, it's the integumentary, the muscular, the cardiovascular, and the nervous system all working together to maintain a stable internal body temperature, and so on and so forth from that chart. Let's talk about some anatomical terms, another little topic here from chapter 1. And this is stuff you're going to be covering in lab too, so I'm just going to zip through it super fast. Anatomical position. I'm not going to stand up right now because I'm not going to lie, I'm in my pajamas. But anatomical position is standing straight forward, legs shoulder width apart, and your palms are facing forward, arms down at your side. You'll see a picture in a few slides. That's what anatomical terminology is. Terms like supine and prone, you're going to get familiar with all of these words as you go through your first lab this week. Superficial landmarks and anatomical terminology, you're going to learn it all in lab. The directional terms, medial, lateral, superficial, deep, all of those, you're going to go through those in lab. You should be familiar with the general terms for regions of the body and landmarks of the body, such as if I say the word oculus, you should know that that associates with the eye, or nasal, that's associated with the nose, or abdomen, right? You should understand where these general terms are referring to. These are going to play a huge role when we get, especially into A&P2, when we're starting to learn the specific blood vessels. A little bit this semester when we do nervous system, we'll learn a few specific nerves that are related, but you'll see that all of this stuff builds on each other. So the stronger foundation you get now, the better it will kind of attach itself into your brain later. It's like a big puzzle, and by the end of ANP2, you will have this huge, awesome picture of how the human body works. So make sure that you start learning these terms now. And then the anterior lower part of the body terminology, like hallux or pubis, femoral, referring to thigh, etc. The back, right, cervix. Cervix is actually referring to the neck. It's not the female body part, just so you know, because we have cervical vertebrae. And then the lower part of the backside. Our abdominal cavity is actually divided into quadrants as well as regions. Different physicians and clinicians will use different terms. Generally, when you're being diagnosed with something, you'll go into the doctor and you'll say, oh yeah, my stomach hurts. I'm having stomach pain. And then they'll say, okay, well, which area of the abdomen is it? And then you'll kind of narrow down and say, you know what, it's kind of hurting more on the left side than the right side. And so that way the clinicians can narrow down exactly which organ or which area you're talking about, so they can start thinking, okay, well, it's on the left side, so I'm pretty sure it's not the liver. It could be the spleen, right? It could be the pancreas, etc. And then they can narrow it down by regions. The regions are just more specific. You should be familiar with, and you will be familiar with in lab, which organs are in each quadrant as well as in each region of the abdomen. And these are some of those terms I was talking about: proximal, distal, lateral, medial. You'll be practicing those in lab, and you should, again, familiarize yourself with those for the lecture portion of this class as well. Here's the chart, goes through all of them. It's best to practice. I suggest actually just drawing, taking just a sheet of paper and drawing a stick figure and sticking a X anywhere on the stick figure, right? It doesn't have to be an artist drawing, and seeing if you can describe where that X is anatomically. It's on the anterior brachial region, distal to the shoulder, right? Or distal, right? Or the distal end of the forearm. You try to see how many anatomical terms you can use to describe where you put that mark, and then put a mark in a different spot. See if you can describe it. Just practicing using those terms is really all you need to do to start learning them. The human body can be dissected in several planes, and you'll see this, and this will come in very important when we start looking at different diagrams. You have to kind of understand the perspective that we're looking at when we're looking at various images. So one is a frontal plane, which is where you would literally just cut down the middle, separating the front part from the back part, anterior from dorsal. And you could do that, just by cutting off your nose would be a frontal plane, or cutting off the back of your head would be a frontal plane. It doesn't have to be directly in the middle. A sagittal plane would be separating right from left. Mid-sagittal would be right in the middle. And then you could have parasagittal, which would be just slightly off to the side. Cutting off an arm would also be parasagittal, because it's just separating right from left, even though it's not quite in the middle. And then you have transverse, which is separating top from bottom. Chopping off someone's head would be a transverse section, just to give you an idea of how that works. Here's another image. The frontal plane is sometimes also called the coronal plane, depending on which textbook you look at. And different textbook editors look back and forth, jump back and forth between terms. This is the chart that goes through them all. You also have to be familiar with the body cavities, which organs are in each body cavity. You should know that. So body cavities are basically isolated areas of the body. They've been isolated from other structures, surrounding structures, and the organs are within that particular region. They're protected by special membranes, or sometimes even bones, in order to protect them from external injury. There are two main body cavities, and that's the ventral cavity and the dorsal cavity. The dorsal cavity, well, let's talk about the ventral cavity first, because here's a nice graphic organizer for you. We never call it the coelom. That has to do with embryological origins. Don't even worry about that word. So the ventral body cavity is basically the abdomen. It's the whole thoracic area. So we're looking at the thoracic cavity, which has our lungs and our heart. the right and left pleural cavity, and then there's this area called the mediastinum, which is where the heart is, it's where your esophagus is, it's where your pharynx is, right? It's where all the major airways kind of branch off and go into the lungs. And then you have the pericardial cavity, which contains the heart, all within that thoracic cavity. So the cavities can be subdivided into other cavities. Got it. Then you have, within this ventral cavity, below the diaphragm, is our abdominal cavity or abdominal pelvic cavity, which can be divided into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. And there's no real division between the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, other than the pelvic cavity sits within those pelvic bones. There's no, like between the thoracic and abdominal cavity, there's a diaphragm there, but between the abdominal and pelvic cavity, there isn't. I just went through this, the thoracic cavity separated into those regions, the heart surrounded by the pericardial cavity, and here you see a nice sagittal section of these cavities, the heart within that mediastinum space. That's what I was talking about. It's kind of this weird empty space between the two lungs, and we'll get to know that space very well next semester. Here's just close-up image, more close-up image, and then the abdominal pelvic cavity also contains the peritoneal cavity. We'll learn all about that next semester. And the diaphragm is at the top of the abdominal cavity. Pelvic cavity is just the lower part of that abdominal pelvic cavity. This is where our reproductive organs are, our bladder. And the kidneys and the pancreas are actually behind that peritoneal lining, behind our abdominal cavity. All the linings of the abdominal cavity, they're kind of isolated towards the back. They're called retroperitoneal. I think that might be our last slide. It is. So that's all the major points of chapter 5. So as we go through each of these lectures, I'm going to be, there wasn't much physiology for me to really map out in this one. But I'll be using, as I said, the PowerPoints as well as my face, as well as a whiteboard drawing tool on my computer, as well as an actual whiteboard that you can see me physically draw on to help you with your learning. So I hope you found this lecture, chapter 1, interesting, and if not, I apologize. I try to make it as interesting as I can. Have an awesome day. Bye.